Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa pounamu te moana. Hei huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai. Tātou e a tātou katoa. Hui e, tai eke e. And that just means may peace be widespread, may the sea be safe like greenstone. A pathway for us all this day, let us show respect for each other, for one another, and bind us all together. Kia ora.
Kia ora. So welcome everyone to this Estuary Health in New Zealand webinar. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Land, Air, Water, Aotearoa LAWA project team. So LAWA is a collaborative project between the 16 regional and unitary councils in New Zealand, the Ministry for the Environment, Department of Conservation, Statistics New Zealand and the Cawthron Institute. We also enjoy the support of the Tyndall Foundation and Massey University. So the webinar has been put together to celebrate the launch of the new LAWA Estuary Health topic that launched last Wednesday. So the LAWA Estuary Health topic makes estuary monitoring results from regional and unitary councils freely available for you to explore. And ultimately, this helps us to all better understand and look after the special places where rivers and streams meet the sea. There's a link there for you to go and explore the new topic, but we ask that you stay with us and check it out at the end of the webinar. Today's panelists are Dr. Sheryl Miller from Greater Wellington Regional Council, who's going to speak to us about estuaries and a Te Ao Māori perspective. We've got Dr. Michael Townsend from Waikato Regional Council, who's going to talk to us about our interaction with estuaries. Dr. Tarn Drylie from Auckland Council, who is also the LAWA Estuary Health Science Lead, who's going to run us through the new topic and give us a bit of an introduction to it. Then Dr. Megan Oliver from Greater Wellington Regional Council, who has put together a presentation about how we can support improved estuary management through policy. And then Helen Kettles from Department of Conservation, who's going to talk about how we can look after estuaries together. We also have Elizabeth Farnham from Ministry for the Environment with us, who's going to join us for the Q&A should there be any policy related questions for Ministry for the Environment. If you do have questions, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type that in. Those questions come through to me and we'll answer as many questions as we can live in the second half. There's also a chat function, but please don't use this for your questions because it's not as easy for us to moderate and keep track of the questions that have been asked. We also have a bank of questions that you kindly submitted when you registered. So we'll try and get through some of the kind of key themes that came through from when you registered. I'm going to pass over to Dr. Sheryl Miller. Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you, Nicole. Tēnā koutou katoa, hui hui mai nei. Estuaries and Te Ao Māori. Once our catchments that fed the estuaries were covered in Indigenous primary forest and wetlands and teemed with birds. Erosion was controlled and slowed by the plants that clothed the land. Rivers, estuaries, and nearshore seas were plentiful in Kaimoana and Mahingakai. Estuaries provided key entry points for Māori who understood that they have ecological, economical, and cultural values. Estuaries were valued as a sought-after resource, with pā often sited on nearby hills to enable iwi to be able to see over their lands and resources. Estuaries were and are valued by iwi because they provide tuakiri, or identity, and whakapapa, that ancestral connection. They support the mana and wairua of iwi. They provide a context for learning customs and mātauranga Māori, or traditional knowledge. They provided access inland where Māori could gather timber for building, harakiki for weaving, and to hunt birds, rats, and tuna. It allowed coastal hapu to trade resources with inland hapu. And they are a tūranga waiwai, a source of health. Many plants were used for rongoa, or medicine. Māori viewed estuaries as food baskets where fish, shellfish, and plants could safely be harvested. It was a source of kai to share with guests and for special occasions. It upheld manakitanga. It supported recreation with whānau and hapu. And there were also large customary fisheries, native fisheries. Their spiritual and cultural dimensions gave them insight into the need to protect and care for their food baskets. As seen here, tuna were an important part of the Māori diet. They were often caught in special traps called hinaki at the entrance to the estuary where tuna were migrating, and then filleted and dried in the sun. Estuaries still have a special significance for Māori today, and many still regard them as food baskets for their staple food. For a number of coastal Māori, this was or is the main source of kai. However, these unique environments are vulnerable to modification. In Te Ao Māori, all of the natural world is seen as being interconnected and interrelated. People, animals, plants, and the environment are linked through whakapapa and mauri, a life force that exists in all living things. Through kaitiakitanga, humans have a responsibility to keep the physical and spiritual balance of the environment intact. Resources are governed by customary rules and traditions, such as mātauranga Māori and the associated tikanga. Traditional ways of hunting and fishing, such as eeling and whitebaiting, were managed to ensure that enough resources were handed down to the next generation to maintain the mana and the mauri of the ancestral land. Manakitanga describes not only the way we care for others, but recognises mana and the obligation to return mana in relationships. In this reciprocal relationship, we respect the mana of the awa that our communities are deeply connected to. We honour our obligation to look after the awa as it looks after us. Estuaries are a toonga and come under the Māori concept of kaitiakitanga, which is about guardianship or protection. It involves conservation and sustainability to safeguard the future for future generations. Many iwi and hapu already use cultural-based monitoring and reporting systems, such as Kaitahu's State of the Takiwā and Atiawa ki Whakarongotā's Kaitiaki Plan, to ensure their ancestral landscape is protected and their people have living relationships with their whakapapa and traditions through the environment. This mātauranga Māori is held by iwi o hapu and not shown on LAWA. As stated in Muri Hiku's Natural Resource and Environmental Iwi Management Plan, Te Tangi a Tauwera, the cry of the people, we belong to the environment and are only borrowing the resources for our generations that are yet to come. Kia ora.
Cool. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Sheryl. So Sheryl's talked about the importance and connection with estuaries, and the fact that you're giving up your time this morning shows that you have a connection to estuaries, that they're important to you. And this isn't surprising when 75% of us live within 10 kilometres of the coast. So the image here is of a kind of generic estuary, and in different parts we'd see different attributes and different components and different processes that underpin ecosystem services and the different benefits we get from these systems. So yeah, they're highly productive systems. So we've talked about shellfish and fish, but these are underpinned by primary production. So for example, not just the kind of bigger plants we can see, but also the microscopic algae that live in sand flats and mud flats in the surface sediment there, are really important for the production of these systems. There's the life supporting capacity in terms of the provision of habitats, their role in climate regulation and carbon storage, and a bunch of processes in terms of water filtration and the cycling and storage of nutrients and removal in some cases. And then obviously the recreational opportunities and our cultural connections. So really important systems. So they are the transition between freshwater and the sea, but it's not just physics and chemistries in terms of their value. The beating heart of value is underpinned and intertwined with the ecology. And this is the role that the various species pictured here play. So various mud crabs, shellfish, crustacean, gastropod snails and worms, and also the plants as well, have a really important role. And you can see this in this diagram, the way that they are modifying their environment, and this is really kind of linked back to those services. But equally, when we modify the conditions of the estuary, we start to impact the ecology. And an obvious issue is sediment or mud. Now, sedimentation is a natural process, but it's been rapidly accelerated by human activities around the margin and in the catchments. And now we see in most or all estuaries a lot more mud than there was there previously. This is demonstrated by this graph here, which is for Coromandel estuaries in the Waikato. It's a log scale, so on both axes. And from left to right, it's going back in time. And on the y-axis, this is the sedimentation rate. So what we see here is that kind of prior to Maori arrival, sedimentation rates were about 0.2 millimeters per year. And then following European arrival, we see a rapid increase in the rate of sedimentation in our estuaries. And while this is for the Coromandel, this is probably indicative of many places around New Zealand. And this is shown again in this old photo from the late 19th century, which shows the deforestation and the damming and the log floats which were occurring with widespread changes across those catchments. And then the contemporary picture where we see sediment in our estuaries. Point to make here, though, is this is not just a legacy. Our current activities can increase or reduce sediment arriving. This happened throughout the 20th century and continues today. So we have changed these systems and we continue to change them. Another type of contamination is heavy metals. And everyday life can contribute to metal pollution, and these contaminants can end up in our estuaries via stormwater or by other means. So, for example, our roofing generating zinc, our disc brakes and anti-fouling paint contributing copper. Lead historically was in petrol and is in batteries, mercury through the burning of fossil fuels. And it's not just heavy metals. I should also add that there's hydrocarbons, oils, fuels, various nasty compounds. And while this might be most apparent and acute in our urban environments, it's not just an urban problem, it's a New Zealand-wide problem. We have cadmium associated with fertilizers, copper used in fertilizers and fungicides, arsenic in forestry and farming, the list goes on. So we have a range of human activities which are resulting in contaminants ending up in these sensitive receiving environments. So the pressures we're placing on estuaries are changing the condition and the suitability for species. And that's affecting where species can live. So the example here, we have pipi pictured. So pipi are highly sensitive to mud. They don't like much mud in the sediment where they're living or in the water column. And we know that if mud increases, that these types of species and pipi will disappear. We also have things like mud crabs here, which found across a wide range of sediment types, but they become really super abundant when the sediment conditions are quite muddy, and they'll be one of the dominating fauna that are present there. And then we have things like cockles, which are present across a range of sediment conditions, and we know they like a little bit of mud, but they prefer generally sandier conditions. So by changing the conditions of the estuary, we're affecting the community of organisms present, and in turn, the various benefits they're able to provide us, and thus the way we kind of value these systems. And these pressures have shaped our thinking. And so here's Tarn to tell us about the LAWA estuary health topic.
Great, thanks, Michael. That does lead us nicely into the topic. So I'd just like to firstly acknowledge all of the people that have contributed to the development of this topic, and particularly the project team and Leslie Bolton-Ritchie, who really set us up in the early stages. So as a bit of background, regional councils and territorial authorities monitor estuaries to understand their condition and how it is changing over time, and especially in relation to human activities that may degrade them. The monitoring can take place in a variety of ways. When the tide is out, quadrats and photos may be used to make observations about the estuary, and samples of the sand and mud may be collected and analysed to understand their specific characteristics. When the tide is in, water samples may be collected to assess water quality. And we also might use different technologies to map the types of habitats that are present at a broad scale. So these are just some of the things that take place in council estuary monitoring programs, and there is a wealth of information available across the country. So when choosing the indicators to present on LAWA, the project team considered that they must reflect the main pressures of our estuaries. They needed to be locally relevant so that they were meaningful for local management, and they needed to be nationally consistent so that a cohesive picture could be presented on LAWA. The key thing was to recognise that whilst estuaries are complex, there are relatively simple things that we can monitor to help understand their health. We ultimately chose 3 indicators for the initial launch of the estuary health topic, and there are 2 indicators of pressures, mud content and contaminant concentrations. And as Michael talked about, these represent 2 of the biggest issues for estuary health across the country. Then there is an indicator of state, the estuary macrofauna. And these critters are really good indicators of health, as they usually don't move very far, they live for several years, and as Michael explained, they're sensitive to different pressures. So we can interpret what things might be affecting a monitoring site based on the macrofauna that are present. These indicators will help anyone that explores the data to understand the major pressures for their local estuary. And regional councils are already out collecting this data and have been for 2 or 3 decades in some instances. So we're really excited to now be making this available through LAWA. And just to note that many councils are collecting more information beyond these indicators, so there is the potential for the estuary topic to grow over time. So where can you find all this new data? As of last week, you'll be able to see the new estuary health tile on the homepage, and this will take you through to the Learn tab of the estuary topic and to access the data you need to get to the Explore Estuaries tab. You can find the region you're interested in and see the estuaries that are monitored within it, and clicking through to an estuary will show you the monitored sites tab and the individual monitoring sites that are within it, and you'll see where they're located with the map on the left. Clicking through to the individual sites takes you to a dashboard of current state for each of the monitored indicators, and you can click on these state tiles to see how the values have changed over time and see a legend explaining the state categories. Another option for navigating to this dashboard page is to select a site directly from the map. And finally, if you know the name of the site that you're interested in, you can navigate directly to it from the LAWA homepage by entering its name into that main search bar. So in addition to the monitoring data, this topic collates information on the broader characteristics of the monitored estuaries. So on the summary page of your chosen estuary, you can see the What Makes My Estuary Unique tile. And this tile tells you about some of the estuary's significant features and general characteristics. And it also has links to relevant council reports and places where you can find further resources. The Learn section of the LAWA website is another great location to expand your knowledge about estuaries. And we've created 7 fact sheets for the new estuary health topic. And these can all be found by searching estuary in the View More Fact Sheets search. And finally, as estuary health is heavily influenced by the activities that take place upstream and in its surrounding catchments, we've created links to the river quality and land cover topics. So from the estuary summary page, the What's Happening Upstream tile will show you any catchments that are connected to the estuary and contain river monitoring sites. And similarly, the What Surrounds My Estuary tile has a brief explanation of why land cover is relevant for understanding estuary health, and then presents pie charts that show which broad land cover classes are present within the catchments surrounding the estuary. So it's hoped that these features will help to demonstrate how the things going on around and upstream of an estuary affect its health, and encourage more holistic thinking when it comes to managing and restoring these ecosystems. So there's lots of information available, and I'd really just love to encourage you to get onto the site and delve into it. So with that, I'll just hand over to Megan to talk a bit more about estuary management.
Thanks, Tarn, and kia ora koutou. So look, having this information on estuarine health collected in a standardised and consistent way and made readily available will go some way towards improving how we manage estuaries. Estuary management is notoriously difficult, with a range of competing values and overlapping responsibilities, meaning that they frequently get overlooked between freshwater and coastal environments. This web diagram, distilled from the mind of one estuary manager and included in the 2020 report from the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment on Managing Estuaries, illustrates this complexity well. This diagram highlights that the numerous pieces of work, legislation, interests and responsibilities there are in managing a single estuary, in this case, Porirua Harbour, an estuarine system just 20 minutes north of Wellington. You don't need to focus on the detail to appreciate the complexity here. So some examples might be, we write policy across all levels of government to guide how we manage the needs and activities of people. But sometimes these policies don't talk to each other or align well. For example, policies set at a national level, such as those that promote more housing for New Zealanders, might conflict with the goals of policies for improving freshwater and estuarine health, because urban development can generate large amounts of sediment from the earthworks and increase stormwater runoff that in turn impacts estuary health. Similarly, at a regional level, regional policies and strategies for improving, say, transport networks or providing protection for people's stuff from natural hazards such as coastal erosion and sea level rise may run up against strategies or policies aimed at protecting biodiversity and habitat. Because, say, building higher seawalls or reclaiming section of coastline to protect roads, railway lines and homes may compete with the need to protect or restore estuary habitat and biodiversity. And then there's the huge range of human values, both cultural and social, that have to be accounted for when we consider whether we conserve, protect, restore or use estuary resources and how. This all means that estuaries commonly fall through the cracks because of overlapping jurisdictions, overlapping responsibilities, ever-changing policies, and inadequate enforcement and compliance. My paraphrasing of this is that everyone and no one is responsible for estuaries. And in the 2020 Managing Estuaries report from the Parliamentary Commissioner, 2 key recommendations emerged that might go some way to improving this. The Commissioner concluded that to achieve genuinely integrated management, we must put estuaries at the centre of everyone's efforts by treating estuaries and their catchments as a single identity, kiu te kitai, which translates as from the mountains to the sea, and making high quality data available so that any decisions we take are wise and enduring. This first point is work underway and funded by central government to consider how we might more deliberately and effectively consider estuaries when managing contaminants that enter from the surrounding land. And the second point is starting to be addressed here today by the LAWA Estuary health topic in making standardised, consistent information on estuarine health widely available. It's also really encouraging that so much strategic research and monitoring is underway that will support more integrated management of these valuable ecosystems. In the research space, there's a wealth of work underway to understand how estuaries function and respond to cumulative impacts, and to develop tools for measuring and communicating those impacts. And combined with the monitoring undertaken by regional sector and a wide range of other agencies, community groups and citizen scientists, we can collectively monitor how these systems are changing through time and set targets for improving estuarine health. In time, we would expect this LAWA estuary health topic to grow and incorporate a lot more of this valuable information and data, and indeed inform wise and enduring decision making. Now I'll pass over to Helen Kettles, who will talk about opportunities for looking after our estuaries.
Kia ora tātou. As Sheryl and Michael introduced, estuaries have long recognised and diverse values that benefit people. And even though estuaries are really a very small proportion of the global surface, they punch way above their weight in terms of those values to us. They are also really important to a large number of species, many of which are unique to Aotearoa. For instance, the Manawatu estuary has 35 species of at-risk and threatened plants and animals. But when it comes down to restoration, understanding the values you want to enhance is important, as is knowing what the main pressures are that you have at each of your sites, and they will differ. So if sediment is an issue, restoring riparian margin by planting will help this, and this may also enhance the feeding areas for the birds. And for birds, maybe predator control could also be something that would be useful. So LAWA is really useful for councils, but it's also really valuable for communities, as been said, and they've got lots of great links to other web pages. One of these web pages is the Our Estuaries Hub, and this is the map on that hub that's been produced. So the map shows the extent of the on-the-ground restoration happening around the country. The red dots are locations where coastal wetland margins are being restored, like in the photo on the right. And if you click on that dot, it'll take you through to the web pages of the groups. Some of those groups are the Waikato Estuary Care Group and the Māori Ongotoro Wetland Society. The green areas represent where there are collaborative processes to restore catchments. And again, if you click on these areas, they'll take you through to the respective websites. So these include catchments being restored by Fonterra, Doc's Ngā Awa catchments, many led by regional councils such as Greater Wellington's Whaitua and Auckland Sustainable Catchments, and many that are led by iwi. So this map makes the collective effort visible, but it's also really good because people can join the effort. They can find out what's going on in their local area, and different groups can connect with each other and learn and share best practice. Some other resources you can explore to make a difference. There's an interactive map showing what other sorts of monitoring is happening around the country. For instance, habitats are also monitored by councils and by DOC. Birds are monitored at many sites by the Ornithological Society. They have annual wade accounts. Cockles are measured by MPI at sites, but also a number of community groups are doing projects around that. There's also a page there with a whole range of citizen science projects that people can get involved with. There's a repository for Te Reo Māori resources, a really awesome teachers resource that's packaging up the best educational resources produced from around the country into a curriculum modules. There's also really good best practice restoration information there. So there are lots of ways that we can all make a difference. The launching of the LAWA Estuaries health topic really is a very big milestone. It's super to now have all this amazing information. Next slide, please. This example from LAWA at Christchurch, this example from LAWA on the right-hand side is actually from a Christchurch site, and it shows that while the mud is still elevated and impacting the site, it has improved. So change is possible, and we can now track the results of our efforts using LAWA. Having lots of diverse people sign up for these webinars gives us optimism about the future of our estuaries. If we work together, our estuaries will be healthier. Kia ora.
Thank you to all of our presenters and to our partners for making today's webinar and the wider Land, Air, Water Aotearoa project possible. Also, thanks to all of you for joining us. We've got about 100 of us on today's webinar, and we're now going to move through to the Q&A portion. So at the bottom of your screen, you should find a Q&A button. If you click this, it'll expand a box. You can submit questions, and I'm going to put these to our panel. I also have a list of questions that you submitted when you registered, so I'll be working my way through that as well. But if you do have any burning questions, please submit these into the Q&A now. I'm going to start with the first question here around mangroves, whether they are increasing in terms of their abundance around the country, and whether this is something we should be concerned about. So I'm going to put this question to you first, Michael, and then if anyone else has any thoughts or wants to jump in, please do.
Oh yeah, so yes, they have been expanding. We've seen that over the last kind of 80 years or more in many estuaries in the top of the North Island. So yeah, we have seen that. I guess points to make are that they're not an invasive species. There's a kind of misconception, and they do play a really important role in terms of kind of carbon stock and potentially preventing other symptoms of water quality issues, kind of acting like the livers and kidneys of our estuaries. But there clearly is a problem, and the cause of this problem is sediment arriving in our estuaries, and also we think nutrients are playing a role as well. So again, fertilizers and excessive nutrients coming off the land. And we do have to be kind of careful how we manage them. I guess we have to be careful what is our desired kind of goal for an estuary. If we cut down the mangroves, is that even possible? What services are we giving up if we're to cut down mangroves? And so it's something that needs to be entered in kind of really carefully, and it needs to be kind of underpinned by good science for decision making.
Oh yeah, Nicole, I'd just add to that in terms of they really do have a lot of ecosystem services, and as Michael mentioned, storing carbon is one of those. They also provide a lot of protection for adjacent land from storm surge, so even more protection than a seawall would provide. And overseas, in America, they're actually insurance companies are looking at giving people discounts if they've got mangroves in front of their property. So they really do, as I said, punch way above their weight in terms of the services they provide to us.
There's lots to consider there. And we've had a question about runoff from agriculture and how much of an issue that is. Also, another question regarding runoff from an urban environment. So we might as well take both of those questions together. Tarn, can you shed some light on this? So you're based at Auckland Council, which is largely urban, but you have got some rural environments around you there. And then we'll pass over to Michael in the Waikato.
Yeah, sure. So I think that really highlights how the pressures that estuaries experience varies depending on what's going on in their catchments upstream from an estuary. So we do see a bit of a difference in what the key pressures are depending on what sort of environment you have upstream. So yeah, in agricultural areas, I think we normally would find that excess nutrients could be an issue from runoff from stock or even fertilizers. Whereas in urban areas, we find that heavy metal contaminants are usually a bigger issue because they get washed off things like buildings and roads and vehicle wear and tear. So it does vary around the country in whichever location you're in, what the main issue is. And I think that then is really why it's key to look at your local estuary, to have a look at the data and see what are the issues for your location. And that really guides how you then go about managing those pressures. Maybe pass over to Mike if he wants.
Yeah, maybe just describe a few things I've seen. And yes, nutrient pollution and causing eutrophication, definitely a pressure that we can see in estuaries across the country. From personal experience in Bay of Plenty, places like Little Waihi, probably most acutely the places I've seen in New River Estuary down in Southland. Here we're talking about excessive sea lettuce and other species of perceived nuisance algae in terms of their extent. You're talking about bacterial mats growing on the surface of sediment. You're talking about very, very thin kind of oxic conditions, so really, really poor sediment conditions. And even to the point where after half an hour of walking around, I had a headache because of hydrogen sulfide. So this is a very, very kind of real problem. And yeah, again, requiring management of what's happening in the catchment and what's entering these estuaries.
Thank you. There's a question here from Tracy about what we know about estuaries in terms of impacts after flooding. So how much study has there been around estuaries after flooding? And I wondered, Elizabeth, you've joined us from Ministry for the Environment. In terms of risks from natural hazards and other kind of weather-based events and things, is the ministry, what kind of work is underway in the policy space from the ministry, or work has been undertaken in this space?
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, so we are in the really early planning stages of estuaries policy development, and they're going to be considered under the national policy statement for freshwater, and looking at how our freshwater and land-based impacts then impact our receiving environments, including estuaries. So we're really at the early stages of determining, what are the greatest risks to our estuaries and what our values are and what we need to do to monitor those. Because estuaries are so varied nationally, it is quite difficult to set national standards for these areas. But yeah, so I guess, the best answer is we're at the early planning stages. We're still doing a risk assessment, and hopefully we'll be progressing the work rapidly rather than slowly.
Well, more broadly, we've had a few questions around kind of the role of climate change and sea level rise and the impacts on estuaries. Tarn, is there anything you would add in that space? We also had another question about ocean acidification. So there's this whole dynamic set of changes that may impact estuaries.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are many ways that climate change will alter the pressures that are faced by our estuaries. Coastal environments in general will be particularly hard hit as they have to deal with sea level rise, ocean acidification, warmer waters, and then the things that will affect all natural environments like changed and more extreme weather patterns. So yeah, there is a whole host of things going on there, and we don't really have a good understanding yet of how they will affect our estuaries. And that's really because none of them will be acting in isolation. So we're likely to see things like sea level rise and acidification occurring at the same time. And they'll also overlap with local pressures that we're talking about on LAWA, such as sedimentation and nutrient enrichment. So it does make it really hard to predict and test what might happen. There is quite a lot of research going on in this space, though. For instance, the Sustainable Seas National Science Challenge team has got a lot linked to these sort of cumulative and multiple stresses. What we do know is that one of the best things we can do to increase the resilience of our estuaries, though, is to keep them in the best health possible. And that kind of follows when you're talking about human health as well. When you're in the best health possible, it gives you the better chance of being able to withstand or adapt to the pressures that come with climate change. So our knowledge is growing in this area, but we kind of know the things that we need to do to give our environments the best chance of coping with that stress.
Thank you. Another question for you, Tarn. A few people wondering what the future plans are with the LAWA Estuary Health topic to include nutrients. A few people, they're surprised, saying, we would have expected to see that there. Is that something that's in the pipeline, and why are we not showing nutrient data currently?
Yeah, sure. So there is data on other important stressors like nutrients that is missing from LAWA at the moment. And many councils are monitoring those things in one way or another. For this first launch of the topic, though, we really wanted to focus on getting data that, like I said in the presentation, was monitored in a consistent way right around the country. And that's important, that we have some sort of quality assurance for the data. And the problem really is that we're not monitoring things like nutrients in a very consistent way at the moment. And so that will be something we'll be looking to do in the future and add to LAWA once we have a bit more of uniformity in the way that we're collecting those samples, getting them analysed, and then figuring out how to report them consistently. But we're super aware of the things that could come next, and we'll be looking to those in the future.
Thank you. And on that topic, we've had a question from Malcolm, who has asked if it's up to various councils to decide what's on the LAWA site, and that there are a number of estuaries in the Gisborne region that don't currently have data available. And I can share some good news with you, Malcolm, that Gisborne District Council, so they do currently monitor estuaries in terms of water quality, but they are looking to expand their programme to also monitor the indicators that are shown on the LAWA topic. And when that monitoring is in place, they will be coming on board with the topic, and so all that data will be available for you to explore. So if we've got your email address, we can flick you an email when that data is online and let you know.
Nicole, sorry if I could just jump in. Just from a ministry's perspective as well, we're currently funding research through Managing Upstream. That's being conducted by NIWA to help with that attributes and indicators research, and also looking at how we can better or provide uniform data across the national level so that we can add hopefully more data or data types to LAWA moving forward.
Thank you. A question for Sheryl around a tangata whenua part of this process of managing estuaries and looking ahead. How does that relationship work?
Yeah, good question. The mātauranga Māori and traditional knowledge stays with iwi. We have been in the Wellington region talking with our mana whenua partners about how we can align our monitoring programs, keeping in mind that mana whenua or tangata whenua will monitor slightly different indicators. So they take a very holistic approach and they look at things not just in the water, but they're looking at access for harvesting, whether it's overgrown. They have a look at the condition of the mahinga kai. So it's in process. However, we might not see any of the mana whenua data on the LAWA, and that's okay. I think it is there. We do know about it, and we do talk to our mana whenua partners and come up with programs whereby we can all work together to ensure the safety and the well-being of our estuaries.
Thank you. A question about geese in regards to understanding their impact in West Coast harbours in the Waikato. So I'll direct this one to you, Michael, but if you've not got any specific examples there, maybe just more generally the role of geese in estuary health.
Yeah, sure. So we've actually done a bit of research on this, and it was a MSc thesis by Michael Ferris, so that's available online. Really trying to see, understand the impact of geese and really what percentage of seagrass was in their diet versus other forms in terms of that kind of cropping pressure. With that, what we saw is that seagrass was a relatively small percentage, but it did increase at certain times of the years by a significant amount. So going from about, I think it was about 4% up to 14% of their diet, depending on the season. And in terms of the kind of management, we know that the geese population have massively expanded since 2011, when they changed schedules in terms of how they were managed. And it is something that across the country we need to kind of get a national handle on.
Thank you. A question about plastics. So is there any monitoring happening on the increased issue of plastics and microplastics and their impact on the ecology of estuaries? So that's not something that the LAWA project team are presenting data on through the new topic, but there is a lot of work happening across the country in terms of plastics. And I wonder, Elizabeth, could you shed some light on what Ministry for the Environment are undertaking in terms of reducing plastics and their impact on our environment? And then Helen, if you've got anything further to add in this space.
Yeah, so last year the ministry launched their National Plastics Action Plan, which is looking at being a more circular and reduced waste economy, especially in regards to plastic, and looking at ways we innovate materials so there's less waste and also less litter in our environment. I think I saw that question, and I don't believe it's been expanded to looking at aquaculture rope and things that are prevalent in aquaculture farms, but it's definitely something that will team up with the plastics team at MFE to talk through as a risk to estuaries. So it's really good to raise. And obviously it's something that we'll have to work with the industry on because, aquaculture is not going to go anywhere, but we can do it better, hopefully.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And Helen from Department of Conservation.
Yeah, there's a really good litter intelligence program around the country that are measuring the amount of plastic pollution on our beaches, and that tends to be the stuff you can see, even though a lot of them are very small. And so there's a website you can look at to explore information on that. In terms of the kind of the microplastics, which come from things like clothing that's made out of plastic. It's the fibers and the washing machines that come down into the estuary. So they're actually really, really tiny. You're not going to sort of be able to see them on a beach stroll. There's some work happening, I think, on emerging contaminants. And this is kind of one of the big new things that people are wondering, how much microplastic is there, and there's quite a lot. There's a citizen science project in the south of Australia where they're looking at microplastics. and there's some research programs around it, but it's definitely one of those things that we're needing to kind of do some more thinking on.
Thank you. We are at time, but we'll take a couple more questions. And if we haven't been able to get to your question, we will follow up with you via email to make sure that we are able to answer, particularly where people have asked questions about specific estuaries. So we probably won't be able to get to those ones today, but we will take a couple more questions. So a question from Richard. Michael, if you can answer this one about if contributing factors are controlled, so those pressures, is excessive sediment buildup generally reversible?
Yeah, I think we know that in certain areas it won't be reversible. So these kind of sheltered estuarine environments, in some places that mud will be there and it will stay. There won't be the energy that will in our kind of lifetimes, which will or kind of a human life scale thing, that will be possible to flush those out. But there will be other areas where when we do control these pressures, we will see improvement. So it's quite estuary specific, but there's definitely the capacity for improvement in our estuaries, yeah, with regards to sediment.
Great. And a question about just really basically definition of an estuary. So Tarn, I'm going to throw this one to you. How do we define an estuary?
Mute. Yeah, that is a really good question, and there are kind of different angles that we can come at it from. So an estuary is technically an enclosed or partially enclosed water body where rivers or streams meet the sea and you get a mixing of fresh water and salt water. And there are numerous different types of estuaries, so they can look quite different. They can have large intertidal areas, or they can almost just look like a river running straight out to sea. And we also call them lots of different things. So we talk about lagoons, inlets, fjords, and harbours are also estuaries. They're just big enough for you to drive a boat through. So it does get quite tricky sometimes, but beyond that sort of technical definition, estuaries are really dynamic, special places that house a great number of different plants and animals. And I think, as we've heard about from the various talks and questions today, they have really high ecological and cultural value. So I think that's the definition to remember, perhaps.
Kia ora. Hey, I think that is a really beautiful place to leave it. So we are going to wrap up now. As I say, if we haven't managed to get to your question, we will email you to follow up and provide some information. Before we go, I'd like to really encourage you to explore the LAWA Estuary Health topic. The link is www.lawa.org.nz/explore-data/estuaries, or just Google LAWA Estuary Health, and we should come up. I'm going to now hand over to Dr. Sheryl Miller to close today's session with a karakia.
Kia ora, Nicole. Ka whakaraia te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara. Kia turiki whakatahi ai. Kia turiki whakatahi ai. Haumi e, hui e, taiki e. And that says restrictions are moved aside so the pathway is clear to return to everyday activities, enriched and united. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Going to start with a question of how are locations selected? So I'm going to put this one through to Tarn as our estuary health topic science lead. So Tarn, the nearly 400 sites that you'll find on the LAWA topic, how have they been selected?
Yes, that's a really great question to kick off with, and this largely reflects the estuary monitoring programs that each of the regional councils have designed. So this can vary a bit between regions, but generally speaking, our monitoring programs are designed to target locations that we expect to be under pressure, and whether that's from increasing mud content or contaminants or any other more site-specific things that might be causing issues there. So that means that actually you might see that there's a bit of a bias towards impacted locations in your region. We also do bear in mind, though, when we're kind of picking locations, that there are natural dynamics that influence the state of the indicators that we're monitoring. So what I mean by that is in the top of an estuary where a river or a stream enters, we usually see that there is a higher level of mud content and potentially contaminants there, just by the nature of it being a less dynamic area. And so as you move downstream from the top of an estuary down towards the mouth where it joins the sea, we usually see there's a higher level of energy, and that means that more mud and contaminants get flushed out. So these are all things that we're thinking about when we're choosing where to put sites within an estuary, and that might go some way also to explaining some of the patterns that you see in the data.
Thanks, Tarn. A lot of questions in relation to climate change and what effect sea level rise may have on our estuaries. I might go to you first on that one, Michael. In terms of estuaries and sea level rise, what do we need to think about there?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. And one, firstly, it's going to be really, really complicated and complex. We don't have a magic ball, that we can gaze into and know exactly what's going to happen. I think, there'll be some key pressures in terms of sea level rise, but also in terms of sedimentation rate. So if sediment is accumulating, is this leading to a deepening of our estuaries, or will it kind of keep pace? And then the interactions between kind of storm frequency, severity, in terms of drought, it's going to and also kind of rising temperatures. There's going to be a huge number of interacting kind of factors. I guess my key message would be that the future is to some degree uncertain, and therefore keeping estuaries in the best state of health now and focusing on the contemporary pressures and doing what we can now will be the best thing we can do in terms of resilience to meet that future.
Thank you. And Elizabeth from just joined us from MFE. So Elizabeth, from the Ministry for the Environment's perspective, what kind of work are you doing around sea level rise and other risks to estuary health?
Right now, we're kind of in the planning stages of our policy development for estuaries on the back of the PCE report, and climate change is definitely top of mind for us. It is quite hard to address all of the risks and threats to estuaries, as we all know, but it is a huge portion of our planning process and how we better integrate with the climate change team to actually make plans for estuaries to better enable, or I guess prevent any further deterioration of these environments, so they actually have resilience when sea level rises and temperatures rise.
Thank you. A question from Jeffrey around quality assurance given to data before it gets into LAWA, and whether the raw data will be available to all. So I can answer that yes, the data will be available from the LAWA download data page. I believe that's going up next week, so you'll be able to download that and explore it for yourself. Tarn, can you give us some background on kind of quality assurance?
Yeah, sure. So the data on LAWA is quality controlled. It's all coming from regional council and territorial authority monitoring programs. And we had sort of minimum requirements in terms of how the field samples were collected. They needed to be done in a consistent, comparable way. Similarly, the lab analyses needed to be done consistently. And then there are things like the minimum number of replicates that were needed and how to treat replicates. So I think the data that you then see on LAWA are averages of multiple replicate samples. And so that was how we went about making sure that there was comparable data between regions and that they kind of met minimum quality requirements. So you'll be able to see quite a lot of that information in downloading the data sheet that Nicole was just mentioning, and that will hopefully come through in that spreadsheet.
Thank you. A question about kaimoana and information on bacterial contamination in estuaries is important, but not currently presented on the LAWA topic. They've asked if there's any specific reason for that, and I suppose this speaks to some of what you covered, Megan, in your talk around different responsibilities, and I wonder if you can just perhaps cover off briefly where some of those responsibilities sit in New Zealand.
Yeah, so this is an example perhaps of one of those variables that we don't monitor consistently or everywhere around the country. Every regional council does this one slightly differently. So that's why it wasn't selected as an indicator in this particular instance. Also, it's an indicator related to human health rather than estuary health. So this particular topic is related to ecological health rather than human health. On LAWA, there is the Can I Swim Here module, which is about recreational health and whether water quality is sufficient for swimming. And that might be the more logical place in time for us to include information about contamination or kaimoana health and whether it's suitable for human consumption. But again, what we still need to establish is some consistent, robust monitoring methods so that it can be done repeatedly around the country. And that's just not the case at the moment.
Thank you. A question for Helen. Somebody, I think they're a school teacher, they want to know ideas for school groups to monitor and engage with estuaries. So are there any leads you can give them there?
Yeah, I think education is super important for estuaries because for a long time they haven't had much airplay, and they are super important. So teaching the younger generation about them is really useful. And there are lots of ways that they can be monitored, and that school children and anybody in the community can do that. There's a Marine Metre Squared program run out of Otago that links closely to the work that councils do. That's really simple, just assessing what's present within a square area on an estuary. There's eBird, which is really great for recording any birds you see on the intertidal flats. iNaturalist is great for recording anything you see. I mean, seeing anything unusual is really handy to record that because it could be some new invasive species that we can get an early indication of. And then the seagrass spotter. So there's lots of things you can do for that. Our Estuaries Hub has got a page where we've collated all the citizen science opportunities in one place, and there's also a really great teachers resource there so that people can incorporate monitoring into learning programs at schools.
A question for Sheryl around Mātauranga Māori and how this is acknowledged or accommodated for with the LAWA project. So it's not something that sits entirely within the remit of the project, but of course there are other sources of knowledge. So can you sort of talk to us about that?
Yeah, kia ora, Nicole. In terms of Mātauranga Māori, a lot of it comes down to tonga species, and some of those species are ones that are incorporated in some of the Western science monitoring, such as the cockles and the pippies. In terms of some of the other cultural values, they are certainly being looked at and monitored by various iwi, but there's a question around the data sovereignty of it. And we work quite closely with many of our mana whenua partners in the Wellington region anyway, sharing data, sharing information. So hopefully at some stage there will be, you'll see a combined effort or more of a combined effort. Sure.
A question from Bill for Michael. He says, very interesting PowerPoint, thank you. If all the sediment input to Coromandel Harbour was stopped today, how long would it take for the estuaries that were heavily impacted by kauri logging to return to pre-European levels?
Oh, that's a $1 million question, and it is an incredibly complicated one because it's going to be to do with the freshwater flows, the dynamics of those environments. We know that there will be certain parts of estuaries which have been changed kind of permanently, that's such that they will not recover, but there's other parts where we have monitored and we do see kind of positive change. So I think the key thing is it's going to be a long time frame for in most locations, but we've seen deterioration over over a relatively short period of time over people's lives, and I think we can also see some improvements in some locations over the same period.
Thank you. A question from Philip around how we can use monitoring data that confirms a degraded state to then turn into advocacy for compliance and policy changes to improve state rather than just slowing the degradation per se. I'll just do a little plug here that there are local government elections coming up, so do speak to candidates and find out what they think and their policy positions when it comes to looking after our estuaries. Megan, is there anything further that you would add?
Yeah, kia ora. Thanks, Phil, for that question. Yes, I would add that we currently do use our monitoring data to drive limit setting or target setting in estuaries. So some of you will be familiar with the limit setting processes that regional councils are carrying out as directed by the Ministry for the Environment. We have to set limits for improving fresh water quality, and those limits need to consider the downstream receiving environments such as estuaries. So when thinking about how we reduce contamination flowing from rivers and streams into estuaries, we obviously look at the data we already have, and if an estuary is degraded, then the first thing is we must halt. We must not allow those estuarine systems to degrade any further. And we need to seek to improve the condition. So already our monitoring data and the data available on LAWA is being used to drive more stringent reductions in contaminant levels upstream. And I would encourage absolutely, community groups to make themselves aware of the information that's available on LAWA. And as Nicole said, consider that information when you're voting in the upcoming elections, but also, to undertake your own monitoring and keep pressure on us as regional councils to make that information available to you.
Yeah, and I'll also just pass over to Elizabeth in terms of work that's underway in the policy space at the Ministry for the Environment and any upcoming opportunities for the public to input.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. As I mentioned, we are currently in the planning stages of estuaries policy development, and that's under the NPSFM, as Megan mentioned, which requires councils to take into account the freshwater impacts on receiving environments, including estuaries. Setting targets and limits for estuaries at a national level is extremely difficult because they're so nationally varied. Even a region has such high variation between estuaries. So we're hoping to work with councils to understand how we can set limits and targets and more regulated monitoring so we get better and consistent quality kind of nationally. And so at this stage, we intend to consult on proposed estuary policy. When that will happen is, up in the air, but keep an eye out because any submission from the public and or coastal experts is welcome.
Thank you. We are at time, but we'll take 3 more questions. So we've got one that's come in around invasive tubeworm species and what methods have been used, such in the Hawke's Bay. So I'm going to throw that one to you, Michael.
Yep. So the worm they're talking about is a thing called Ficapymantis. It's been in New Zealand since the kind of 1960s, and it's been in the Hawke's Bay since the 1990s. It's a really effective ecosystem engineer. So it's building these kind of calcium carbonate tubes, which are literally kind of clogging and kind of blocking up the estuary. And there's other examples of this kind of elsewhere in the country and historically. They actually blocked the cooling drains of the Otahuhu power station, I think back in the 80s maybe. But yep, so in terms of kind of fixing the problem, I guess one of the things is often invasive species can become quite abundant in quite disturbed environments. So to fix the problem, well, there's the physical way of using an excavator or digger, which I think Hawke's Bay Regional Council have been doing to kind of remove the material and kind of free up the kind of waterways. But there's also not just dealing with the symptom, it's dealing with the cause of the problem. And likely for this polychaete, it will be to do with kind of water quality. It's a filter feeder and is probably doing quite well in the eutrophic conditions, with kind of really advantageous conditions that it's finding itself in. So addressing issues with water quality is probably a part of the addressing the cause.
Thank you. We've got a few questions about what's next. So we've got these indicators up, what's coming. One of them around nutrient concentrations, whether that's something that's going to be covered in the future. Tarn, where in terms of the project's direction, do you see kind of what are some of the next cabs off the rank potentially?
Yeah, so I think nutrients is a really obvious one, and I think that would probably be one of the easier next cabs off the rank. I think quite a lot of councils are already monitoring sediment nutrients as well as nutrients in the water column as part of their water quality program. So yeah, I definitely think that's a key one. Other things which would be, I think, quite straightforward might be things like sediment organic content and chlorophyll A, which also give us a bit of an idea about whether nutrient enrichment can be an issue for an area. So I think it's a case of doing a bit more work to see how consistently we are currently monitoring those things and see how much work it would take to get them to a point where they're cohesive enough to present on LAWA. But I think as a wider topic, we would be really keen to add coastal water quality in general to the estuary health topic, and that is monitoring all sorts of things like temperature and nutrients and pH. And so it's just quite a big task to get that all aligned across the country and get it ready for hosting. But I think those would be the things that would be turning our attention to next.
Brilliant, thank you. And the last question is an open one about restoration and improvement. So I'm going to throw it to the floor. How can we look after our estuaries better? What are some of the steps that people can take as individuals, and then that we can think about as communities more broadly? So I'll start with you there, Helen. What are your first thoughts?
I guess it's like, climate change. What can we do for climate change? The actions we can have can be very broad, and that's the same with estuaries. You can work at the catchment level or the margins. I think one of the things that I think that last slide of mine showed, that there are improvements, is that where we see improvements in estuaries, we learn from that, just as we learn about the degradation, so that we can figure out how restoration actually delivers results to the estuary. So I think scaling up the stuff that we're doing well is a really good thing to focus on.
Thank you. And Elizabeth, from Ministry for the Environment perspective, is there anything in particular you'd encourage people to do?
I guess it's just to participate when we come to that public consultation, and also we're always open to emails, suggestions. It's good to know what's happening out there at the moment. I guess from a personal perspective, reduce plastic use, because plastic pollution is a huge issue in our coastal area too. I know the ministry is pushing for a more circular economy, and we can all do a bit to help with that.
Yeah, fantastic. Sheryl?
Yeah, I would suggest just go down and introduce yourself to your local estuary. Go and have a look at it. Find out who else is working in that area, and if you can join in and help them, or start your own community group to do some restoration or a cleanup. Yeah, Kora?
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Megan?
Yeah, like Sheryl said, sort of further to that, if you know what's kind of normal for your local estuary, then you'll know when you see something that's out of the ordinary too. And all regional councils have pollution hotlines. Report stuff that you see that doesn't look right. If it's litter, if it's an unusual foam or oily, something on the surface of the water, or something's untoward, sediment plumes when it hasn't rained, report it, because we can investigate those and we can find out what's going on in the catchment that might be causing unusual pollution events.
Yeah, definitely. And Michael?
For me, I'd say just every day make good choices and good behaviors. We see the little symbols of fish on the drains. It's having that kind of attitude, a reminder that everything we do and the kind of pollutants we kind of generate will often kind of end up in these receiving environments. There's many things we do to estuaries and the coastal environment more generally that it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. We don't see what's happening underneath the water, and we kind of do things that we'd never kind of do to a native forest, just because we can't really see the results of what we're doing. Yeah.
And last but certainly not least, Tarn.
Yeah, so I think everyone had really great suggestions. So I'd just say go and look at LAWA, explore what's going on in your local estuary, because the main pressures for each of our estuaries might be different. And so the best course of action for you to take might vary depending on where you are. So go see what's going on, communicate the value of your estuary far and wide. And I think discussing your shared values and vision for your estuary with your community is really important.
Thank you. Hey, thanks everyone for joining us. The link to explore the LAWA Estuary Health topic is www.lawa.org.nz/explore-data/estuaries, or just Google LAWA and you'll find a link on the homepage.